Hi there, I'm Jen. This is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a wrap-up of my Booktube Prize reading. I was assigned one of the translated fiction groups, and I got lucky in that I had read a couple of them already, so that made things easier. But I had an interesting experience with one of them, so this may turn into a rant at the end. So I'm not going to go in the order that I'm ranking. I'll include a separate thing on that at the end, but yeah, here we go. So first up, I'll mention the book that I read last year, and that is Semezdin Mehmedinović's My Heart. This is translated by Celia Hawkesworth, and I loved this. This author is somebody whose poetry I've loved. Interestingly, most of his poetry that's available in English is translated by Emil Alcalay, who is obviously not the translator of this book. So when you are reading a different translator of an author, it's always interesting to see how the voice changes, if it does. And I would say in here, you still have the same feeling of voice, and it did feel like revisiting, because this is autofiction and a lot of his poetry is autobiographical, so it did feel like revisiting and meeting up again. Hawkesworth's translation is a little more British, which I would say is the one negative that I have towards this, just because this book in part is about the author, or the character based on the author, and his son driving across the United States, and he did live in the US for 20 years, so when he speaks English, he speaks a more American English, so having some of the bits that were British English feels somewhat artificial, but I think it's very minor. I have certainly read other books where that stands out more, and as complaints go, that is just a tiny one. I thought this was a fantastic portrait of both crisis of late middle age, because sandwiching the cross-country story with his son is the author / character having a heart attack, and then at the end it's the wife having a stroke and memory loss, and it's just such a fantastic portrait of that life stage, and suddenly realizing, oh, you've gotten old, while still talking about in a very general way, but also in a very specific way of being in exile, and what that means, and kind of the history of the Bosnian War in the background. What's really interesting here is I saw a couple of people who read this without having read anything of the author's work before, and there are bits in here that are a single throwaway line that is kind of intriguing for people who are doing that, reading this without having read anything else from him, but that for me, having read his poetry, I recognize that as a reference to a particular event in his real life. And so that's kind of fascinating. So you will have a different experience of reading that book depending on if you've read his other work before. So yeah, I loved that. I don't think it's a surprise that's going to be my number one. Next up, I have Selva Almada's Brickmakers. This was translated from the Spanish by Annie McDermott. And in this book, we open with two young men who have killed each other, but they're not quite dead yet, so they're dying and flashing back to their childhoods and their family stories and different relationships. Based on their families both had kind of similar problems of fathers who disappeared or who were killed, a lot of violence and borderline poverty, and a family feud that is between the two families that they belong to. This is described on the blurb as being kind of a Romeo and Juliet story between two sons in the families that these two men have come from. And I really don't think that that's a great description, because on the one hand, while there is a relationship that has led to this mutual killing that we've seen, it isn't central in the way that what I think most people would think of as a Romeo and Juliet type story. It really is more centrally about the families, and one of the main characters from one of the families is not the person in the relationship that's being described as Romeo and Juliet-esque. And so I think if you go into this expecting that, I think you might be disappointed, because this is really a portrait of inherited family trauma, essentially. I thought this was incredibly successful. It is quite graphic, and I think more graphic than some people would be comfortable with, so just a heads up if you're going to read it. But yeah, I thought this was really top-notch, and I really enjoyed the way we go back and forth between people's memories, and how the memories of different people from different angles will look a little different, and also how it looks different at different people's ages, because we are following these guys from basically birth onwards. Not really following, but going back in their heads. So really top-notch stuff. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Next up, let's talk about Alex Schulman's The Survivors. This was translated from the Swedish by Rachel Willson-Broyles, and this is a family drama that is structured like a thriller. So we have basically two plot lines, one which is the current day plot line, which is moving backwards in time. So we start at the most recent piece and we move back to something that's a couple of days before. And we're following these three brothers who are going to go spread their mother's ashes on their old cottage site. And then moving in the right direction are the flashbacks to their childhood from the middle brother. I don't think it's a spoiler to say, since it is structured like a thriller, that there is a twist at the end. And the thing with a book like this is that the twist has to work if you reread it. And I wasn't going to reread this because I didn't actually like it that much, but I did grab the audiobook from my library and I listened to it again while I was walking the dog. And to my mind, the twist doesn't hold up when you consume this a second time. So to me, that is a failure. I think if you are reading this once and you are not reading it very carefully, if you're, reading this on a beach vacation and there are 100 people around you and you're not paying that much attention, I think this is probably fine. If you listen to the audiobook and you're doing your laundry at the same time, I think it's fine. But if you actually pay attention to it, I don't think it holds up. Because the issue is we are in this the one brother's mind. And again, I don't think this is a spoiler. Because it's structured like a thriller, you figure this guy is not going to be a reliable narrator. But because the twist happens at the beginning in his timeline, he would have to be thinking about his memories from a different perspective than he is as we follow them. And so I thought that whole thing doesn't work. It doesn't hold up. So this is fine as a general thriller if you're not paying attention to it. But as soon as you think about it, it crumbles. It doesn't hold up. So not a fan, but to be fair, I'm not the biggest fan of thrillers in general. So yeah, it is quick to get through though. So next up, I have The Phone Booth at the Edge of the World by Laura Imai Messina. And this was translated from the Italian by Lucy Rand. So the main character in this book is a woman who has lost her mother and daughter in 2011 tsunami in Japan. And she goes to this phone booth, which is something that actually exists, although the specific setting is fictionalized somewhat for this. The phone booth isn't connected to anything, so people talk on the phone to people who are missing or people who are dead. And by going there, she meets all kinds of people. They talk about their various griefs. She mostly ends up interacting with this one man whose wife has died. Relationships develop, and people talk about moving on and developing after grief. I think as a kind of book club, let's talk about an issue book, I thought this was solid. I didn't expect to enjoy this. I have seen a few people talk about this and describe it as overly sentimental and overly saccharine and overly self-helpy. But I honestly didn't think it was any of those things. It reflected for me, I'm not a self-help kind of person, but I do enjoy hearing other people talk about their experiences of things like grief support groups. And when I've talked to people who have done that kind of thing, a lot of the stories felt very familiar in that to these. And so it felt realistic in a way that was borderline sappy, but not too sappy. I was reading this as I was having my car serviced, so I was hoping it wouldn't, be the emotionally manipulative to the point that you start weeping in public. And it wasn't, but I did feel touched in points. And I mean, it is, I would say, not the greatest work of art, but I think it's perfectly successful as a book club type read. I thought this was pretty reasonable. It's the longest book that was in this group, but there's actually a lot of white space in this book because a number of the chapters, or basically alternating chapters, are actually just little blocks of extra information that were discussed in the chapter previous. So if there's a thing where a character is making a list in their head, the next chapter will be the list that they made in their head. Or if somebody references their full legal name in one thing, the next chapter will be that name, things like that. So it is not as long as it looks. So yeah, I mean, this wasn't my favorite thing. I would not have picked this up if it was not in this group, but yeah, I thought it was reasonably successful as a kind of a general piece of popular fiction that you could read with a group and chat about issues. So yeah. Next up, I have a book that I don't know what to think about. This is Mieko Kawakami's Heaven, which is translated by Sam Bett and David Boyd. This is, again, a short one, in which we follow two middle school students who are being bullied in really extremely physical ways. And so there are a lot of conversations about things like morality and about why things happen and people having suicidal thoughts and people wondering about the meaning of life and being told there is no meaning and there is no morality. And I think that's all really interesting, but I didn't feel like any of these people sounded their age. There is one point where the main character, the main of the two characters that we're following, the male character, is talking to one of his bullies, and he's kind of interrogating him as, what did I do to you and why are you doing this? And none of their conversation is really believable for children of that age, especially given how incredibly graphic, like there's genuinely physical bullying in this in which the kid could have died. And then later, the two kids who are bullied are having a conversation about whether, again, the boy is going to have his lazy eye corrected. It's discussed in almost the way that people talk about cochlear implants or limb lengthening surgeries for people with achondroplasia or something, which are controversial procedures, right? But the procedure that they're talking about is not controversial in that way, so it was odd to see it presented that way. It felt like a shallow approach to something that is an actual deep topic that in a lot of circles matters, but this, yeah. So my impression with this is that the author is trying to do something really interesting, but it didn't come together for me, or at least it didn't end up in a place that was at all satisfying. So yeah, I appreciated the attempt at doing something really interesting, but I didn't think it fully worked. So yeah, I mean, it's the kind of book where there are a lot of good lines, but then you think about this is supposed to be a child saying it, and I don't think I believe that. So there we go. All right, so finally, we have Livaneli's Disquiet. And this is translated by Brendan Freely, whose translations I have read before and I have liked before. But here we go. This is one of the books I had read ahead of time, and when I had read it, I had a couple of questions. One, well, let's start with what it's about. Basically, this is about a reporter in Istanbul looks at somebody who was killed in a hate crime in Germany. And it's a childhood friend of his, and he grew up near the Syrian border, and he finds out his friend had been broken up with his local fiancée to become engaged to a Syrian refugee, and so he goes down to his hometown to investigate what happened to his friend. So weird thing number one is the friend's name is spelt the English way. His name, so he's Hussein, but it's spelt the English way and not the Turkish way, which I found really weird, because you see that in translations from 100 years ago and translations of stuff for kids and translations of stuff for kids for 100 years ago. Like, you know, Peter and the Wolf, it's not Petya, it's Peter, it's Pierre in French, you know. But we don't normally do that in English, in modern translations for adults. So that was weird to me that they changed the spelling of the character's name, especially because lots of other characters have their names spelled the right way. So I thought that was an odd choice and kind of a patronizing choice, like that the Anglophone audience can't handle if it's not spelt the English way. So that was odd. Later in the book, we have a section that is about the guy being killed in the hate crime in Germany. And there's a line in there where the character who was killed, his brother, is talking about this neo-Nazi. And he comments that he especially hated like black people and Latinos. And I thought that is really weird for a German neo-Nazi. And so I wondered to myself, is that a mistake that Livaneli made? Or is that something that Freely translated for an presumably Anglo-American audience and it looked different in the original? So I thought to myself, I will look that up in the original. And I took that out of the library. Now, so the chapter, so that section starts with a chapter in here that's called Germany, Germany. So I'm looking in here, I think this is going to have a chapter called, I don't know, Almanya, Almanya, right? No, let me show you what this is called. Yeah, you don't need to speak Turkish to know what that means, right? In the original, this character is murdered by an American neo-Nazi. So the brothers, in this, they moved to Cologne, and then later they moved to Duisburg, I think. In this, Chicago, and then Jacksonville. In this, the neo-Nazi was radicalized because he watched a lot of videos online of journalists being beheaded. In this, the neo-Nazi's brother was killed in Iraq. genuinely, this is not a translator's job to reset where things happened. And I mean, this is something that every reviewer mentions, that this guy was killed by a neo-Nazi in Germany, but he was killed in the US. Like, this is the most baffling translation choice I have ever seen. And I don't understand this at all. It is so patronizing. Like, why would you change the entire setting of this? Change the cities, change the... So, I mean, it's hilarious because if he hadn't written, if he hadn't left in the line about the guy especially hating black people and Latinos, which he, for whatever reason, freely didn't translate that to something that would make more sense for a German neo-Nazi. Like, I wouldn't have even checked. And, like, why? Why would you do that? I don't understand that at all. So, here's the thing. When I read this, it was a quick read. I read this all at once. It's very heavy-handed politically, but because I agree with the politics, I don't really mind that. But I do think that detracts from the quality a little bit. I think there could have been more nuance. It's also very male, and not in a macho way, but in the way that goes almost to the other side, where it's very kind of patronizing to women in general. And when the main character is talking about his ex-wife and then the Syrian refugee that his friend had been engaged to, that's all a little gross. But like, I was entertained as I read this. You know, I was going to say this is good enough for what it is, but knowing what the translator did with this, I don't know how to properly talk about this, because anything that I liked about this, you know, it's not the same book anymore. And a translation should be translating the book. Like, there are obviously some things that are not going to be translatable, but Chicago doesn't translate to Cologne. I'm sorry. You know, the United States does not translate to Germany. That is not how that works. It's outrageous to me that that's what the translator did. I don't understand it. If you change something that is a plot point that every reviewer talks about, it's not the same book anymore. So I don't know how fair it is for that to have a bearing on my ranking, but it has to, because I can't unknow that that part of the translation is a lie, essentially. Especially because I know very little about Swedish culture at all. Certainly don't have enough familiarity with Japanese culture to know what, to catch if things were wrong in these two books. I mean, this was written in Italian, and the author is originally from Italy, but she's lived in Japan since she was at university, and that's where the book is set. So those and this, I don't have cultural context to notice if something would be flagged as wrong. So again, I don't know how fair that is, but it has to have an impact because I do know. So here we go. So my number one is going to be My Heart, because I loved this. I think it is successful. I think genuinely the only complaint that I think you could have about this is some people don't believe that autofiction is really fiction, which I think is ridiculous, but that is something that's out there. I think that is genuinely the only negative about this. This is fantastic. Or if you don't like poetic writing, but this is top notch. Next up, Brickmakers. As much as I complained about the blurb on the back, this does a great job of both having an interesting story and telling it in an interesting way. Here's where it's tough. If I didn't know the translation thing, I would put Disquiet in third. But I do know the translation thing, so I'm going to put The Phone Booth at the Edge of the World, because I don't think this is trying to be as ambitious as Heaven, but I think it's more successful at what it is trying to do. So yeah, I'm going to stick that in third. I'm going to put Heaven in fourth, because I think it's trying to do interesting things. I didn't think it worked, but at least it was trying. I'm going to put Disquiet in fifth, because it's an easy read, it's engaging, but the translation's a lie. And The Survivors has to be last, because it failed. Rereading it, it doesn't work. And I think if you're going to have a twist ending like that, it has to work when you go back to it. And so it failed. All right. If you had this group, I'd love to hear what you thought. It's funny, if I'd gotten the other group, who knows? I'm also reading both versions of one of the books that was in the other translated group. And so far, I haven't found anything that's a lie. Like, anyway, yeah, if you've caught weird translation changes like that, I'd love to hear more about that, because I genuinely don't know how to deal with the fact that, like, I can't read Brendan Freely's translations anymore. He's translated a lot of stuff that I've liked, and yeah, you can't trust that now. It's weird. Oh, I don't know what to do with that now. It's frustrating. Anyway, yeah, let me know how your Booktube Prize experience has been, or if you've found other translations that made you think, why would you do that? Yeah. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.